Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Meyer. I'm the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator here at the University of California, Merced. Today, we have our monthly AMA and Ask Me Anything series that features some expert on some sustainability-oriented topic. And today, we have Ciara Williams from Plan. Happy to be here. Happy to have you. Thanks, Elle, for joining us. Ciara, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Ciara Williams. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm one of the co-executive directors of PLAN, which stands for the Post-Landfill Action Network. And I would say that my area of expertise is environmental justice. I have experience as a grassroots environmental justice organizer in my hometown of Chester, Pennsylvania, where I organize against an incinerator. We're also working to support people to understand how environmental issues are interconnected with other issues such as land use, zoning, public education, and so much more than that. And I think that the environmental justice framework definitely lends itself to kind of understanding the overlap between issues that appear to be so different from each other. So that's a little bit of my background. And I also have experience working in the Office of Sustainability in Philadelphia city government. And I also have some experience working at the intersection of public art and environment. So definitely excited to answer any questions.
Ooh, there's so much there. All right, does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. I guess to begin, I'd love to hear more about art and activism. What is the value of that? There's a couple of different things here too. Like there's this whole movement right now with destroying art. Like the activists in Europe are, I guess they're not destroying it, but they're throwing tomatoes at like big glass encased paintings, right? So that's kind of an interesting work of art in some ways, but then there's also, art activism where you're inspiring others through your art. Do you have any thoughts on any of that? And are you an artist yourself?
Thank you for these questions. Yeah, I actually do watercolor and ceramics, and I don't really have as much time for that, but I definitely do consider myself an artist in those realms. And then to respond to your questions, I'll kind of split those up. I think a critique of like high art is very valid because often those artworks are so disconnected from people's experiences. So I can see why a response may be to like tomato, like a super expensive art piece that doesn't really seem to have a value or a purpose when it comes to our everyday lives. So I'm really grateful for my experiences working between art and environment because our goal was to really work at art as it relates to people's everyday lives. So I worked at the Mural Arts Philadelphia, and what we did was working to kind of restore public space so that it was artful, it was beautiful, but also so that it could facilitate certain connections being made between people. So for example, one of our projects was a workshop and makerspace, which was created in the back lot of a public school, a public elementary school. And we wanted to reimagine that space as not only educational and useful for the students, but also educational and useful for the parents and other community members. And this was a neighborhood in Philadelphia that has so many different languages present in it. So we also wanted to use art and nonverbal ways of being together and engaging each other to kind of bridge those connections beyond language. So art was a really transformative tool, not just in transforming the landscape, so totally changing what it looked like, kind of rehabbing the concrete, making it safe and fun for the young people, but also transforming the relationships that exist in that community as well. So I feel like that's a good example that speaks to that connection between art and environment.
Yeah, were you able to evaluate the community response with that? Or at least anecdotally, like how did the community respond?
Yeah, I would say that it's a common occurrence for certain communities to be targeted for certain projects like this. And often they're not really participating in the building of these spaces. They're not really participating in the ideation phase of things. They're often only participating at the beginning when people are brainstorming and at the end when the project is revealed. But with these projects, the community was involved at every single stage, and we were also able to pay parents to become ambassadors for the project and holding a variety of events throughout the duration of the project, which took over 3 years. So it's definitely a longer term investment in the community. So I would say anecdotally, the experience was positive. The people really appreciated being involved so directly with the work. They really appreciated seeing their ideas manifest and play out, so they could really see the connection between the input that they were giving and the final product of the maker space and workshop.
Did you say 3 years?
Yeah, that's like the average for the project. So Mural Arts has a bunch of different initiatives, and what I'm specifically referring to is the Restored Spaces initiative. So it's not just a one-off project that happens in like the span of a few months, but it's really like a longer term engagement where we're really trying to build a strong connection and relationship with the people in the community. So 3 years at minimum.
Yeah, so how do you do that? How do you engage people and keep them engaged for so long?
Yeah, I would say that first, the first step is kind of building trust, just becoming a familiar face and showing up, not just when it benefits our projects, but showing up when there were events going on in the community, showing up at parent-teacher nights, and just like becoming a familiar face. So that's basically how the project started, was just us hanging out in the classrooms, us engaging the students and the parents and the teachers in the work that they were already doing, and then figuring out what does it look like to extend that work into this maker space and workshop space. So that idea actually came out of our engagement with the students and the parents. We knew that we wanted to remove the concrete from the schoolyard, but we didn't know exactly what would fit in its place. So I would think that kind of starting the project in a way that is so open and able to be shaped by the participants is a great way to get people engaged and bought into the project. And then it's really about that consistency. So that's why we really take our time with these projects, because we're not really trying to rush through something, since it does change over time, especially as more and more people are being brought into the process. So I think like 2 things, it's really just becoming a familiar face, positioning yourself as supportive of the existing efforts and commitments of the group, and then really consistently carrying out the project. So we stayed in the community for over 3 years, and there were meetings like every couple months, with some smaller meetings in between.
That's awesome. All right. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free and put them in the chat. I'm going to move over to one from the registration. Are Black Americans more likely to live near facilities that produce toxic materials than their white counterparts? If so, why?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And there was a landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race, that actually proved the connection between race and proximity to polluting industry. And I believe that report was done in the 80s. And then another report was done following that by the same group. And that actually found that race became even more of a determining factor. And I guess the short answer to why is thinking about whose communities have value and whose communities don't. So over the period of decades, there has been a systematic disinvestment in Black and Brown communities. And that disinvestment creates space for these toxic industries to then come into those communities. And the assumption is that these communities aren't organized because they don't care about the environment and so forth. But when you really do your research, you can tell that these communities have been systematically disenfranchised from voting, from other forms of decision making. So there's definitely more to that, but that's like the rationale but behind that disproportionate exposure to toxic industry that is faced, predominantly by Black and Brown communities.
So you mentioned this report and it came out in the 80s. And, you would think 40 years later, we would have made some semblance of improvement. Yet I don't think we have made much. So in that realm, how can activists like us avoid burnout? Because if you're working at this for like 40 years and nothing's changing, I can imagine folks might get a little burned out on the issue. So how do you avoid that? Do you have any mentors that you look to that are champions of avoiding burnout and practicing self-care?
Great question. I appreciate that. I'll actually point to plan theory of change, which is our points of intervention theory. And our POI theory, we use it to understand the larger system that waste is situated within. And of course, incineration is a facet of waste, since it is a tool of removal and disposal of waste. And the point of intervention theory basically teaches us to look at the larger system that waste is situated within. So not just looking at incineration, but looking at consumption, production, extraction, and so forth. And with that theory in mind, we're taught that there are so many different people working at different parts of this system. So I think like part of how I avoid burnout is realizing that there are so many people doing this work. I am not the only one by any means doing this work. So there are times where I may be less front and center. There may be times where I'm less present. And there may be times where I'm in more of a supportive role for the people who are more front and center in the work. So that's kind of a way that I avoid burnout, is just pacing myself and recognizing that I'm not alone, and also recognizing that there are so many different ways to get involved in this work. You don't really have to be present at every single action, but you can take an approach that's more educational. You can be building awareness of the issue. You can be feeding people and supporting people. So there are really countless ways to be involved. And I really do encourage people to think about their own capacity and where they're coming from right now, so that they're not really overcommitting or putting themselves in a position where they are going to burn out. And I do have mentors, and I'm so grateful for them. They definitely encourage me to pace myself. They also help me to think about what point of intervention is most salient for me based on where and how I'm currently positioned to. So they really teach me to be strategic.
Thank you. Fantastic answer. If anyone else has words of wisdom for that question, feel free and put them in the chat, because burnout's a real thing. And I think a lot of us are maybe not approaching it, but definitely might be facing it at some point in their careers or in student life and, so on. Okay, so someone else asked, how do we build coalitions to fight climate change?
I would say look at the coalitions that are already present and existing in your immediate proximity. I think likely there are people organizing around the issue of climate, and sometimes it is obvious and evident, but sometimes it's not. I think that people are organizing at so many different levels, and they may not always use the language of climate change, but when it comes to the work that they are doing, it is very much in response to climate change. And an example that I can give that's specific to Philly, which is where I currently am, is our work around urban heat island effects that the city is running. And there are people who are organizing getting air conditioning units. There are people who are organizing awareness about how to properly ventilate your home, especially if you are in a row home that is extremely hotter than other types of housing. So I would say definitely look at the work that is existing and figure out how you can make those connections to climate change if they're not already there, because climate change is such a broad issue and it definitely affects so many different things. So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of position that work so that it does more explicitly engage climate change.
Excellent. So Jeff has a comment / question in the chat. It's been 30+ years and nothing has changed. Why am I telling my students to keep charging up the hill?
Yeah, I have two responses to that question. I think my first response is that many of us don't have a choice but to keep working. Just thinking about where I'm coming from. I'm from Chester, and that's the site of the largest incinerator in the US. And knowing that that is there, knowing of the impact that it is not only having in Chester, but also in the surrounding areas, I am realizing, that this issue isn't really going anywhere. And at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize the wins that we do have. I think as incineration arrived in Chester in the 90s, there wasn't really concerted effort against environmental racism and environmental injustice until the residents of Chester, like many communities around the US, decided to organize against the issue. So I think that there are many wins that accumulate over time that we can kind of lose sight of. And even though the organizing against the incinerator is ongoing in Chester, currently the core organizing group has shifted their approach to not only look at getting zero waste ordinances implemented within the city of Chester itself, because the city has been hostile to that type of work, but they're really looking at the other municipalities that are feeding the incinerator. As the largest incinerator in the US, Chester residents make up a very small portion of the waste that is burned there. A lot of it is coming from Philly, from Jersey, from Delaware, from so many other places. So they're organizing in collaboration with people in those places, and they're actually making some grounds at establishing zero waste ordinances that will eventually cut off the supply to the incinerator. So I think understanding the wins that we do have, and also knowing when it's time to shift tactics and strategy is important. And it's not easy, it's not always pleasant, but I think that there are immense wins and gains that movements have achieved over time.
Absolutely. So one thing that I'm thinking about is, how can we get folks to just consume less so we don't have to incinerate as much? Do you have any tips on that note?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably slightly different if you're talking about at the individual level or at the institutional level. I'll talk about the institutional level since that's a lot of the work that Plan is doing on college campuses, is really figuring out how to build zero waste infrastructure within college campuses to reduce the amount of waste that is produced. So I really think that it's helpful to get a baseline sense of the type of materials that are flowing through the institution. So thinking about what waste is being generated in dining halls, for example, or in student housing, and then figuring out, of the waste that is generated, what are the easy things that we can eliminate? And then what are the more difficult things to eliminate? So often the easier things can be things like implementing reusables and so forth. And I really think it's about kind of like going back to this idea of pacing yourself, getting to a point where we are zero waste is not really something that's going to happen overnight or going to happen quickly. So I think building momentum by raising awareness about the waste and the impact that the waste has, and then really implementing behavioral shifts and also bringing in resources that allow people to change their behaviors is a good place to start. And Plan has a host of resources that support colleges and other institutions to really think about the waste that is flowing through their institutions, and also figuring out what does it look like to disrupt and eliminate some of those items. I definitely encourage anyone who is interested in learning more to check out our website at postlandfill.org.
Do you do any work with younger students than university. I know Jeff teaches at high school level, and I'm doing some work with my city schools, the elementary schools, on food waste reduction. So do you do any work with other ages?
That's great. So our materials are actually available to anyone, not just people who are on college campuses. So our hands-on work is more directly with college and university students. But I would say that indirectly, sometimes our college and university students are themselves engaged with younger people, and we have supported them to carry out that work in a way that brings in these environmental justice and zero waste principles. So we don't work with younger students directly, but our materials are really open to anyone who is interested.
Excellent. Jeff, hopefully that's helpful for you. I'm gonna look at those materials and see if it's helpful for us as well. I'm sure it is. But we're doing some work with city schools, like I said, to teach them about food waste. And that's a particular challenge in its own. Jeff says, our students are trying to get wood burning energy stations in California to burn dead trees in our forests instead of going into the atmosphere during forest fire. Would you be willing to meet through Zoom to help our research?
So I would say that I am not familiar with this particular issue, but I'm happy to talk more about it. And if I can't help, then I'm happy to direct you to someone else who is. And I'm actually going to drop my email in the chat, which anyone is welcome to use if you'd like to talk more about any of this.
Excellent, thank you. Cool, I would love some sort of like great connections to come out of this. How did you in particular get into this field?
Yeah, I would say like a lot of people in environmental justice out of necessity. I grew up near an incinerator. At the same time, I learned about the incinerator as a student, and there were other issues going on in my community related to public education. Public education received major funding cuts at that time, and that drastically impacted my quality of education. So I was kind of in a moment where I was trying to kind of connect the dots, trying to figure out why my community was kind of bearing the brunt of all of these different things, not just incineration, but other toxic industries so close together in proximity to neighborhoods. And I realized that this is not coincidental. And I also realized that Chester is not unique in that it's not the only community that is kind of overly burdened with a dense concentration of polluting industries. So in doing my own research and trying to understand what I can do, I found other communities that are facing similar things. And then that's when I got, I guess, educated about environmental justice. And ever since then, I've been kind of sticking to that as my own guiding principle that really shapes how I understand these issues and also how I go about addressing these issues. So I would say I got involved out of personal experience and almost necessity.
I feel like that's how most activists get involved and stay involved. Is that it, personally affected them. I have a background in food insecurity and was food insecure. And so that's why I'm fighting this fight of food security and such. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
Sure.
How would you define environmental justice?
Yeah, so I would say first, a great place to start is actually the principles of environmental justice, which I believe were ratified in the early 90s by the People of Color Convention. And that is a multiracial group of people coming together and trying to figure out what is the overlap between their experiences and how can we create an environmental analysis that kind of makes the connection between environment, health, race, impact, and all these other things. So I think that is an excellent resource because it really has some very clear and straightforward demands that even though that was created over 20 years ago, they're still quite relevant and also quite timely. So that's a great place to start. But I would define environmental justice as a movement and as a theoretical framing. So as a movement, environmental justice essentially encourages us to look at the interconnections between people and the environment. We cannot think of people as separate from the environment, and we cannot think of environmental issues as solely relating to non-human actors. Environmental issues really impact people at the same time as they're impacting the environment. So I think that is like the theoretical, I guess, framing that environmental justice is trying to interject, is that we really have to think about these things together. And then that allows us to bring in issues such as race, class, and all these other things. And then as a movement, I think environmental justice is people working to address threats to human and environmental health. So that's like brief definition of environmental justice for me.
That's a great definition. Thank you for that. All right. Other questions from the audience? No? Okay. So let's see. Someone asked, how did you know this is something you should pursue? What setbacks did you face, and how successful has the initiative been? As in, how successful has plan been?
Yeah. Let's see. So how did I know? I'm really interested in this. So in addition to me kind of feeling compelled to do it just because I have a personal stake in it, and my community has a personal stake in it, I'm also very fascinated by the research and by the scholarship, by people's personal testimonies. I just think it's like super fascinating. And it's an opportunity to not just bring in science, but art and all these other different things. So I've been lucky enough to be able to engage environmental justice at different levels. At city government level, which includes policy, at the level of art, at the level of education, which is like currently what I'm doing at Plan. And I would say stumbling blocks. As a younger person, I thought that the only way that I could engage environmental justice is by protesting, in the streets. And I think that that's one important way. I think direct action is incredibly important, and definitely has a place across many different movements, not just environmental movements. But I think that there's also a place for research. There's a place for so much. So I think that was a stumbling block that I experienced, especially as a younger person, but I'm quite over that at this point. I know that my commitment to environmental justice is something that will never change, to be completely honest, but I know that how I engage and how I push forward environmental justice will change, and that's okay. And then I'll say, like, successes related to Plan. I think ultimately the work of Plan is really trying to encourage two things. I think it encourage accountability. We definitely all have a role to play, and at the same time, not just the individual accountability, but also looking at institutions and at corporations and how they are creating and proliferating this issue of waste, especially single-use plastics. And of course, that's tied to extraction and all these other things. So I think the goal of Plan is to really expand how people are looking at waste. And it's not just about composting and recycling. Those are definitely key actions that we can take, but it's also about wanting to challenge and transform the larger system of waste, so that we can not only deal with material after it's disposed of, but we can also be working along the entire system. And I would say that we, of course, have a ways to go, but I do think we've had major successes on college campuses all across the US in terms of implementing reusable programs, engaging in campus-wide visioning exercises, making demands of board of trustees, and so much more. So I would say that the work is definitely ongoing, but there are definitely successes that we can point to.
Thank you. Great answer. Pardon me. You mentioned policy a little bit ago and working with the government, and tomorrow's election day. So
yeah,
what advice do you have for people from a policy standpoint? How can we get more involved in the governmental level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that, I guess, knowing that policy is very incremental, and that you may have a very clear and achievable demand, but in terms of how that gets integrated into a policy, that it can take time to work that policy up to where you want it. So I would say that working within the government really taught me that it's about that balance between working within the existing structures, so voting and pushing for certain policies and developing relationships with key lawmakers and decision makers. I think that that's really important work, but at the same time, there's also so much possibility and so much work that will take place outside of those existing systems of decision making. So I think it's really about knowing when to ask for something to be done, and when to just do it yourself, and not necessarily individually, but when to do it in collaboration with others who are also noticing that. So I think not everything is going to be done willingly by government, and so much is actually done outside of government, and eventually the government sees that and it's like, okay, we're now bought in, and now we're gonna use that as a model and scale that up at the city level. So I really think it's about like balancing between those two things.
Great answer. Yeah, everyone, make sure you vote, or hopefully you've already voted if you're mailing in and everything. Don't you, or doesn't Plan have a conference coming up this week?
We do. I'm so glad you asked. Yes, we have our Students for Zero Waste conference, which is going to be taking place virtually and in person in Philadelphia. And it's taking place between November 9th and November 13th. And because of the generosity of our sponsors, we're actually in a position to offer free virtual registration to anyone who's interested. So I'm going to drop a link to our newsletter that has more information about how to get registered. But it's a great event and a great space to really continue these conversations that we're having right now.
I did register. I'm very excited. I'm hoping I can attend most of the things virtually, but as my schedule allows, of course. Will they be recorded?
So we did record them last year. I think so. I think they will be recorded. I can double check.
That would be really awesome and really helpful if you could, just because life gets busy. So if we could have the recordings, that would be very resourceful, I think, for folks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can email you. Oh, and look, we have Jensen, who is our Director of Education and Resources. And yes, these sessions will be recorded. So we'll make them available to people if they're not able to attend in real time.
Excellent, excellent. All right. And then Jeff had a question. What were some of your best memories of protests you were in?
Yeah, so many good ones. I would say when I was in high school, and I mentioned the state budget cuts to public education, and I would say a really positive memory is when we did a sit-in in Senator Pileggi's office, and he had multiple offices, one in Harrisburg, one not too far from Chester, and then another somewhere else. And we just kind of occupied his office, wanting to gain his attention and wanting to get his ear so that we can talk to him about the budget cuts. And he never showed, so that was a down moment. But then it became more lively again, as people kind of put it into perspective for us, especially as young people who were wanting to like have that face-off moment right then and there. They really reminded us that it was about the long haul, and kind of the connections that I was able to make with the elders in the movement in that space was really positive. And we had a pizza party in his office before leaving. So I feel like that was a moment where we kind of turned what felt like a loss into not necessarily the win that we wanted, but we were able to see the benefit of our actions. So I think that's like a moment that stands out for me.
Excellent. That's a great question too.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan wants to know, what was the hardest roadblock for you to overcome?
Let's see. I would say the hardest roadblock is, I would say that, so Chester is a small city of around 30,000 people. And putting that into perspective, one could make the argument that is such a small population that even though this incinerator and the other things are having a negative impact on them, this is still serving the greater good because it's disposing of the waste of hundreds of thousands of people, as compared to the 30,000 people who are, made to live in proximity to the incinerator. So I would say that relating to that, the biggest roadblock is kind of, I guess, like seeing the importance of this struggle, and not as a struggle that stands alone, but as a struggle that is so interconnected with many other communities that are facing incineration and other issues. And even though you can kind of write that off and say, oh, it's a small community, it's for the greater good, it's just incineration or whatever, I think a challenge is kind of saying, no, I'm not going to accept that. Even if it is a small city, even if it is impacting a small subset of this larger population, this is still an injustice. So I think that there are so many things that kind of force us to see this as normal and to say that's just how it is. And I think a struggle is saying, well, even though that may be how it is now, we won't stand for this, and we will make sure that it is not like this forever. So I think that's been a challenge throughout my experiences as an organizer, is saying like, I'm not going to accept this. Yeah, I think that's it.
Excellent. Raquel wants to know, who is your biggest inspiration? So like I said, Jeff works in a high school, so he's got a lot of students.
Awesome. Thank you for these questions. Let's see, my biggest inspiration. I don't have one. I have so many. So I'll try to just pick two inspirations. That's so hard. I'm gonna say that Chester has a long history of incredible environmental organizers, one of which is Zelene Mayfield, who is still active and still at the center of the organizing efforts. And I'm really inspired by her because of her tenacity, because of how bold she is, and how just how incredible she is at really putting all these different things into perspective and really not taking no for an answer. So I'm definitely inspired by her, and I guess I'll leave it at that. I'd say Zelene Mayfield.
There were about 10
awesome.
students who hung around after school to see the interview. Oh, cool. So you're inspiring awesome. People. Thank you for that. Awesome. All right. Some other questions from the registration. How do you successfully communicate to various socioeconomic and cultural groups the importance of environmental justice?
Yeah, that is a good question. Going back to an environmental justice, which says that um, people are interconnected with the environment, I think that at an intrinsic level, people understand. People can look around and say that this is having a positive impact on my experience, this is having a negative impact on my experience. So I think that in my experiences, it doesn't take much convincing, honestly. And even working in the city government and coming into places to talk to people about environmental justice and being intentional about connecting it to their lived experiences. This isn't something that is far off. This is really something that impacts our everyday lives, and not just our lives, but the lives of our family members, the lives of the people who will come after us. So I think putting it into perspective in that way really allows me to talk to just anyone about the environment. And one phrase from environmental justice organizers that really resonates for me is saying that the environment is where you live, work, play, and go to school. So literally the environment is everywhere. It's not just the seemingly pristine natural environments that are wild, and it's not clear that they've been touched by people, but the environment is really everywhere and everything. So I think with that perspective, it allows people to kind of enter into the conversation and allow them to see what is at stake for them personally.
Yeah, so you mentioned something earlier too that I want to go back to real quick. How could rural folks organize, or I think we were talking about coalitions, and you said that there's like always coalitions around and everything, but what happens if you're in a very rural area and folks want to get involved? Do you have recommendations from like digital activism?
Yeah, so I would first say that I'm not in a rural environment. So my answer is actually drawing from people who I know who are organizing in more rural environments. And sometimes even connecting digitally is a challenge for rural organizers who don't really have the strong internet connection. So you may get the voice, but you don't really see people, or you don't get anything. So that's really tough. I would say really thinking about ways to bring people together, and it may not be as frequent as it would be in a more urban setting where there's public transit and there's all these other things. But I think thinking about the places that are kind of communal centers for people. Are there gatherings at places of worship, for example? Are there community events that are kind of interspersed throughout the year? And is there a way to kind of engage people at those spaces? So I think it's often less about creating another event for people to go to and more about plugging into the things that people are already doing. And this is an urban example. This is something that we did in Philly when we were doing the urban heat island work, is that we would table outside of grocery stores. We knew that people really loved this one grocery store. We knew that it really had like a wide variety of items that appealed to multiple ethnicities and cultures. So that is where we went to kind of collect people's information and to get their feedback about the work that we're doing. So I think, especially in rural areas, I think you have to get creative and really thinking about how to interject that organizing work in these spaces that are already drawing people.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. It looks like Jeff is typing something. I don't know if it's for us, but we'll give him a minute to type if that's the case. Oh, we lost someone too. What are some of the most important skills, both hard and soft, for someone interested in focusing on environmental justice?
Hard and soft skills. I would say that they range. There are ways to engage environmental justice at the level of like geology, and climate, study of the climate. There are ways to engage environmental justice from the perspective of literature. There are so many people who are doing the work in so many different ways. So I really don't have a concrete answer to that. I would say maybe start with what you're interested in, and figure out how people are already making those connections. And I've already talked about my interest in art, and that is what took me to mural arts as a way to continue to engage this environmental justice work. So I would say it's really a range, but I think ultimately it's really about a commitment to understanding the impact that these different actions have on not just the environment, but also on people. And you can understand that impact through reading. You can understand that impact through interviewing people, through making observations just out in the world. I think there's a lot of ways and a lot of skills that you can employ to further environmental justice.
Great answer, thank you. Check in the chat. Have you seen the heat island study for solar panels by San Diego? Is that Universe? San Diego Universe?
No, I haven't. I'm curious about that. Is there anything you'd want to say about the study? I'll definitely look it up.
I think we're working on an answer here.
Cool, thank you.
And Jeff, if it's easier, you can unmute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the University of San Diego did research when I was applying for our school district. We have solar at every one of our campuses, and it's the parking structure. And I found the University of San Diego did research that it saves 90% of the heat island effect because of the solar panels suck it up before it actually hits the ground. Only 10% of it cuts through. So it actually would be benefit larger cities to put in the parking solar panels to save on the heat island.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I look forward to reading more about that study. And I think that that would be an amazing intervention, especially in urban areas.
Awesome. All right. What is the most common misconception you see regarding your work?
A common misconception. That's tough. I would say a common misconception related to environmental justice is that it's more so about the outcome and less about the process that achieves the outcome. And to be more specific, I think often environmental justice is reduced to let's improve the air, let's improve the water, let's improve the environment. And I think that that is, of course, a major part of environmental justice, but another key component of environmental justice is making sure that people have the ability to shape their environment. So it's really also making sure that people have the ability to participate in decision making, and that people have the ability to really influence what is happening in their environment. So it's not just about producing an environment that is healthy, but it's also about really producing a society in which people's input and people's experiences is not just valued, but it's intentionally asked for and intentionally made space for. So I would say that that's a common misconception in environmental justice. I think a key part of environmental justice is this idea of self-determination.
Wow, that's a great answer. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to save my favorite question for last. And since actually we have 5 minutes, I'll go ahead and ask this one so that we don't run over, because potentially it could be a long answer and it might have follow-up questions. I'd like to ask people, if you had a magic wand and you could fix one thing about the current system, whether it's our food system that we're talking about or the environmental justice movement, what would you do with a magic wand?
Wow. Yeah, that's tough. That is really tough. That is so tough.
Feel free.
Huh. I guess there are a lot of things that I would change. So I think I'll just try to like pick one of those things. I would say removing obstacles to decision making. There's a long history of people fighting for voting rights, for example, and other forms of decision making and representing not just in their communities, but also at the regional level, at the national level. So I would say, like, if I had a magic wand, I would make it so that people are able to shape their environments, whether that is like surveys or meetings or whatever. I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but I think so many people are not represented. And if I had a magic wand, I would make it so that those people were represented. I think that better choices would be made if more people were represented, especially those that are intentionally and systematically cut out of those decision-making processes.
That's a great answer. Really echoes kind of what we've been talking about today.
Mhm.
All right. So any last minute questions from Jeff, Jensen, Chelsea? I have a feeling Chelsea might be related to Ciara, maybe.
No, surprisingly not.
So it's just a coincidence.
I was just gonna say real quick like that, well, our students will get hold of you. We've been working on a forest institute, trying to help out what's going on in our forest. That's the reason that we asked you the question about the trees burning up. That over the last 3 or 4 years, we've put more carbons in the air through forest fires than we have in all of the car usage over the last 20 years. We don't start cutting down the forest fires. Does it really matter if we're going to electric car? So Governor Brown he built 13 wood burning factories in our state. So we could cut these trees down, burn them, use the energy that comes from these plants. It costs we had the Sierra Pacific come in along with, they actually got along with the Sierra Club. And they said, yeah, we need to thin our forest. We need to get these dead stags out of there because they're creating mega fires. Now they're called giga fires because they're just big. But if we burnt the wood, we could filter the carbons out before it reached our atmosphere, and we'd get energy from it. Plus, it would make the forest safer. It costs 14 cents a kilowatt to cut them and ship them, versus they could sell it to PG&E for up to 60 cents a kilowatt. So it would be a money-making venture along with the Environmental Safety Act. So we'd be combining two positives. So when has that ever happened?
Yeah, awesome. I look forward to talking more about that.
We're going to share that with you and try to pick your brain because we know you're a genius at this. So you could help us out and point us in the right direction if we see that we're headed in the wrong way.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it sounds like y'all have done an incredible amount of work and research to get to that point. So I definitely commend you all for that. And I look forward to talking more.
Thank you. We're looking forward to trying to hook up with Governor Newsom's person in charge of education, and then have the kids drive up to Sacramento and present it to them. And then if it's good enough, maybe we'll be able to to pull on the governor's ear and see if there's a chance. We've had Cal Fire in our classroom. They love the idea, so we're hoping that we can move it up the chain, make our air a little cleaner here, especially in the Central Valley.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us and all your answers, and thanks for tuning in. I look forward to the conference on the 9th, you said. And again, there's free registration for folks, so feel free and register. Also, make sure you vote if you haven't already. And thank you so much, Ciara. Again, this was fantastic.
Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.